This video is sponsored by Ridge. More on them later.
I mean, I guess we should, shouldn't we? Is it time for this already? Because I could have sworn I was here recently, with the suit and the bad games and the very real auditorium behind me. But here we are again, talking about bad games. I don't know if that's a sign that the year's gone by very quickly, or that I've done so many of these over the years that they're kind of just smushing together as roughly the same experience. But I'm here now, in the suit. Might as well talk about some bad video games.
How is it that 2021 has felt both like a brief pit stop and incredibly long when I think back to just how many terrible games came out this year? It's not like there haven't been any good games, but I feel like there's been a larger than usual number of disappointing, underwhelming releases that promised so much but fell so far below what they should have been. And since I had the displeasure of playing through a lot of just really awful video games this year, then I feel as though it's my sworn duty to inform you people in time for Christmas so that neither you nor anyone you know makes any mistakes with the games they buy. Otherwise, you're going to have that awkward conversation a few days after Christmas about what kind of fresh hell was purchased as a present, and everyone's going to feel uncomfortable. But in that case, it might be encouraging to hear that I have a bit of expertise on how to solve feeling uncomfortable. I used to own a chunky leather wallet that made it look like my Brazilian butt lift had gone horribly wrong, but one day I saw the light and was saved by Ridge, who were kind enough to sponsor today's video with their incredibly sturdy wallets that are available in more than 30 colors and can hold up to 12 cards that you can now carry around in your front pocket with a bit of style. Plus, Ridge were also kind enough to send me their waterproof commuter backpack with a shock-resistant laptop holder and their larger Weekender duffel bag, which both have an external USB port for on-the-go charging, and when the world stops being on fire, I'm going to be using these a lot. Ridge comes with a lifetime warranty, so you can buy one wallet for the rest of your life if you so wish, with a 45-day return window for a free refund if you're not such a fan. Get 10% off today with free worldwide shipping and returns by going to ridge.com/RabbidLuigi and using the code RabbidLuigi. It's time to move your wallet into the future.
Alright then, I guess it's time for our yearly dose of fucking disappointment.
There comes a point during every year where I become all too aware of the game that I'm playing. Not always a bad thing, but more and more I'm trying to throw myself at games that I usually wouldn't bother with in the hope of finding something worth talking about. And it means that there's always this moment every year where I have to stop and almost take in my surroundings for a second time. This happened with a strange little game called Buildings Have Feelings Too, which almost sounds like a joke mocking how Pixar films are all about abstract concepts having feelings, but actually it's this city management game where you play as a building, and you have to shuffle the residents of your city around to suit their needs, except the residents are also buildings, and I suppose have feelings too. How bold of you to assume that I have feelings. There was definitely a moment where I thought to myself, what the hell am I spending my time doing right now? It's a wild idea for a game, and I'd be on board with it if Buildings Have Feelings 2 was as well made as its premise is creative, but there's an incredible disconnect between the charm of the game and the frustration I feel when trying to solve some of these very specific puzzles with very inflexible solutions. There's a lot of aggressive time management going on here, and that doesn't mesh well with the laid-back nature of the game's presentation, and it quickly makes the whole experience all the more frustrating. It has that Super Monkey Ball vibe where you'd imagine that the game is going to treat you right, but it's hard as balls. The difference here being that Monkey Ball is about skill, and this thing is about commitment. And I sure as shit have no loyalty to the city management game where you play as a building. It's still better than the last SimCity game though. Back when the world was less on fire than it is now, there existed this wonderful year called 2019. Alright, it wasn't that great, because I was still living with my piece of shit roommate, and I was ordering takeaway pizzas 3 times a week and put on a lot of weight. But before the virus came in and shut things up, I used to go to this wonderful event in the UK called EGX, which is a pretty fancy trades fair for video games that I loved because of its exciting selection of indie games. Basically, I'd come to play the big AAA games, get turned off by the massive lines, and instead go chill out with the indie games where the developer is literally standing next to you. One game that I played in 2019 was called Skatebird, which is a Tony Hawk game with more hawk than Tony, as you pull off sick tricks as a bird on a skateboard. Really fun, and the sort of game you see in a lineup and think, yeah, I want to see what that's like. It saw an official release this year, and you'd think that I'd love all they've done in the 2 years since I last played it. Except I prefer to reserve my love for things that aren't nothing. Not to say that there's nothing of value to Skatebird, because there's still a decently fun game in here somewhere, but my issues mainly arise from how little has changed since I last played the game 2 years ago. That version of the game was rough around the edges and little more than a proof of concept, but it's allowed to be since it was apparently 2 years away from being released. You'd imagine that something would change with the game in that time, but the version that people have to pay money for is still as bare bones as the game I played for free in a London convention centre. I don't know how much the pandemic played a role in the development of Skatebird, but apparently the game was delayed from 2020 because the dev wanted to make a story mode. I think more work should have been done on the basic concept than extra features, since bird on a skateboard gets boring after a while. A little more substance, that's all.
I don't want to be too harsh with Skatebird because it is a fun concept and a silly enough idea that when you see it in a lineup of other early development games, it's actually a really fun thing to spend some time on. But the problem is, as soon as you start paying money for the privilege of playing it, it's got to be a bit more game. I'm not afraid to say that Skatebird needs some more depth, as very weird as that sounds.
Harvest Moon is dead, long live Stardew Valley. This has been my coping mechanism for many years once I worked out that Natsume had no idea what they were doing with this franchise, and now we've got this Story of Seasons split due to disputes over naming rights and how Story of Seasons is technically closer to the style of the original games, but still not that good, and all I can say is thank fuck for Stardew Valley. Eric Barone is a god and should be worshipped as such. Meanwhile, Natsume is still fumbling around with their correctly named franchise, and I'm sure a part of me is supposed to be happy that Harvest Moon World shows that Natsume want to do something with this series, but I can't escape the nagging feeling that they still don't know what they're doing. I know someone who does, though. The whole gimmick of World is that your farm is now portable and can be moved quite easily, but despite this fantastical idea, the main bulk of the game is solving problems in the many towns in the game. There's some nice variety to the climates in these areas, but the locations themselves and the people who live there are incredibly boring and lifeless, and the only part of any substance that is worth playing is a mediocre version of the farming simulator archetype that has been around for decades. Harvest Moon games were always capable of injecting the relatively mundane activities of daily farming with some charm, but World seems to have forgotten to do anything about that, and so it's just a slow, tedious slog through the same environments over and over again until you get bored enough of the farming to play something else. These games now need so much more than usual to stand out, and World doesn't even try. How do you make a pocket farm boring?
Despite the general vibe this video is giving off and how the internet reacts to bad video games, I don't like to hate a game. You know, I do try and find a positive in whatever I'm playing and ensure that, you know, even with even the bleakest video games out there, there is something of value to be found. You need to know this before I talk about Of Bird and Cage, because that game is weird and terrible and I kinda don't hate it.
Experimental games deserve at least a little bit of slack for their boldness and their refusal to conform to the handful of well-trodden tropes that get wheeled out every year. You need to understand that I really wanted to like Of Bird and Cage because of how hard it fights against what a conventional video game is, and instead markets itself as a metal album presented through a 2-hour-long story-driven game. That's a lot to unpack, and hard to judge against the criteria we use for other games, but that's the thing. Of Bird and Cage isn't as divorced from video game norms as it claims to be, and is actually full of quick-time events and narrative choices. Which is handy for me, because the avant-garde music stuff is interesting, but everything else is really terrible. The presentation is nice and a welcome change of pace, but it doesn't matter what kind of concept album game Of Bird and Cage is when the game part is some seriously undercooked puzzle solving, sprinkled with quick-time events that have you complete objectives that aren't highlighted for you. So you need to distract your boss or something, and you're floundering around looking for anything that looks useful as this metal music plays in the background, and it's such a weird experience. At times, it's like first-person Heavy Rain with some terrible puzzle elements drizzled all over some crappy plot, as some admittedly pretty tasty jams play in the background. Next time, just release the album. or spend more time in the lab with the experiment. Oh god, Crazy Taxi is such a good game. Not the sort of game that is easily replicable, as Sega found out themselves when they tried to make sequels, but such a unique idea for a game that lends itself to some really fun moments. It has been a while since that first game though, and clearly Team 6 Game Studios thought so too, because they recently made Taxi Chaos, which is honestly just Crazy Taxi again. It's a little blatant, but if you do it well, there's nothing wrong with retreading the same path that Sega hasn't done much with recently. Hey, it could even make for an enjoyable spiritual successor if you can be fucked to keep making it. The issue is that you spend most of the time playing Taxi Chaos comparing it to Crazy Taxi, and there's literally no way of avoiding the comparison when the devs have made their influence so obvious. Crazy Taxi has this incredible energy to it that Taxi Chaos falls some way short of replicating. It's actually amazing how quiet the city you're driving through is, and it's less Taxi Chaos and more like Taxi Library. It's missing a lot of features and a lot of things to do once you've gotten used to escorting passengers around the library, but hey, it's fine because apparently the devs are going to be adding more cars and more features and some music that doesn't sound like it was found in YouTube's creator audio library, but I'm not sure why we're releasing half-finished video games. I didn't know that EA were responsible for this. There are few more awkward experiences than playing a bad horror game. The aim is to scare the player, but that's quite hard to do when you can see the game coming apart at the seams as you play, as fear, or rather the potential to feel fear, is replaced by mockery, I guess. Bad horror is a trip for sure, but I always like to see people create new and interesting styles of horror. Failing that, maybe people just attempt to recreate PT and see how that goes for them. Evil Inside, not to be confused with Evil Within or Konami's cancelled horror game PT that this game is undoubtedly inspired by, can be beaten inside an hour and has nothing of value for you. So, yeah, that's cool. It's a blatant copy of PT, right down to the general premise of the game and the design of the looping hallway that really seems to be drawing a little more than mere inspiration. The problem, other than the obvious, is that it then puts itself right next to PT, and the comparisons are really unflattering and highlights the lack of original stuff that Evil Inside has to offer. Every time it's not just copying PT, you can feel the lack of interesting ideas bleed through, and it ends up feeling like a fan game that you have to pay money for. I know we're desperate to play something as good as PT again, but this is not it in the slightest. New games are hard to make, apparently.
Evil Inside is actually kind of hilarious when you think about it, because it's trying to be the PT that we never got. You know, it was basically a playable teaser that wasn't very long and we never got the finished video game, but Evil Inside itself can be beaten inside an hour, so it's actually probably shorter than PT was. Like, it's trying to be the finished article, but it actually isn't, and I'm just wondering, would Konami buy Evil Inside and pretend that it's some kind of new horror game? I've seen them do worse.
You'd be surprised just how many awesome sounding game concepts struggle to live up to their premise. It's an elevator pitch that never gets further than that first discussion, and it's sad really because so many amazing game ideas end up wasted on games that can't do them justice. Werewolf The Apocalypse is the latest in a very short line of games where you get to play as a werewolf and tear out people's throats, and while you might be immediately reminded of Twilight Princess, the only game that kept coming back to me was Devil's Third, which if you don't know was this stupid action game that didn't take itself too seriously. Werewolf The Apocalypse comparatively takes itself a bit more seriously and leans into what life would be like if there was a vigilante from the Pacific Northwest who could turn into a werewolf on command and felt like taking down evil corporation of the hour. Definitely the potential for a really fun, goofy game if you combine the right balance between seriousness and, you know, werewolves. What do you think happened? The keen-eared among you will recognise the name Werewolf The Apocalypse from the tabletop game of the same name, which is absolutely what this is supposed to be based on. And it's actually part of a wider series that includes Vampire the Masquerade back when they made a video game of that. So there's theoretically some pedigree here, which should have been encouraging for Werewolf The Apocalypse, but sadly it's a game that isn't really able to do anything right. Stealth isn't horrendous, but it starts to become a problem when every stealth section feels exactly the same, and as soon as you're found, you have to make do with undercooked combat draped over a horribly weak story. I don't know why you go to the lengths of getting the license of the tabletop game and then wasting it on such a poor attempt at making a video game. Please don't let this put people off making and playing werewolf games in the future. There's still so much more we can do with that. Did you know that GTA 5 is coming out next year for next-gen consoles? Did you know that Rockstar have been re-releasing that game for 9 years, which is almost as long as Bethesda have been re-releasing Skyrim for? I'm sure the sequel will come one day, but for now it seems like Rockstar can do no wrong as they continue to milk that cow with no signs of it drying up anytime soon. Besides, if you keep porting your most successful game, you won't have any spare time to create a remastered trilogy of older GTA games that botches every good thing those games did. We're gonna need a lot more GTA 5 to forget that this happened.
It is my belief that remasters and remakes are under a special type of pressure before they come out, because the base game is there, and generally speaking, you only tend to remake and remaster a really good game. So there is the finished article that you can copy and alter in so many ways to get your remake in whatever kind of state you want. So the fact that there are some remakes and remasters out there that are fucking terrible, that's really bad.
Bad remakes and remasters are one thing, but when the originals are as consistently incredible as GTA's 3 to San Andreas are, then we need to ask some serious questions. The Definitive Trilogy is honestly one of the worst remasters I've ever played, with only a passing resemblance to the games it's based on that becomes suffocated under an avalanche of glitches and poor optimization. The issues run deep and are so numerous that I couldn't cover them all if we started this video with this game, but giving the project to a dev studio with a history of mostly porting games to mobile devices was probably the first mistake, especially since these games required more of a back-to-front restoration than a mere porting of existing assets. Graphically, these games are a mess, and any early promise from the trailers deflated under the reality that these remasters have a new coat of paint on some seriously dated game design that is somehow glitchier than anything seen decades ago. These games always needed to be updated to modern times. They still do. If we weren't already at that stage, we're at the point where any game made by Konami comes with an overwhelming feeling of dread. They're so done making games that anything new is always met with skepticism and raises questions of why, and so what's wrong with it then? I remember that new Contra game from 2019, and it's the sort of thing where you're happy to see a franchise supported again, but with the slow realization that this isn't the Konami of old. They're simply looking for licenses they can prop up in the hope people throw money at them. This year's victim was Pro Evolution Soccer that has trundled along as an alternative to EA's FIFA for years now, without competing too much since FIFA has the sort of monopoly that is pretty much impossible to wrestle control of. Konami clearly thought this too, and so PES is now called eFootball and is free to play, and so cheaply made that you can feel it fall apart as you play it. Always the sign of a top quality product. It's kind of crazy how quickly Konami's reputation is unraveled and how any game made by them is tainted from the outset. It's also a little wacky that anyone at Konami or anyone who worked on eFootball 2022 thought that any of this would work. You don't have to try too hard to be better than FIFA these days, since EA's been recycling those games for years without making improvements, so to see Konami fumble the ball this badly is honestly surreal. It plays like what you'd get if you described football to someone on their first day of Earth, with broken physics, a painfully slow game speed, and graphics that look like they started rendering at the start of the match and never finished. It's an unflattering comparison for eFootball because a better example of this same idea is so mainstream, but the timing couldn't be worse, since this is supposed to be a big relaunch for the franchise that would take Konami's football series in a more exciting direction with more terrible color schemes, and now it's basically dead in the water. If you copy and pasted FIFA, you'd have less problems than you do right now. Props for creating alien life, though. I'm always mindful to not be too harsh on indie games. It's often the work of one person or maybe just a small group of people who are pursuing their passion for game design and simply encountering a few bumps along the road. Indie games should be cut a lot of slack because these guys are out here making video games and I'm just a guy who talks about them, so one of us is contributing a hell of a lot more. The real villains here are established studios pumping out sewage and cramming it onto a disc to sell for close to full price, and if we start thinking like that, then frankly there was only ever likely to be one winner here. The writing was on the wall very early with Balan Wonderworld, because I remember there being this subtle buzz on Twitter the day the demo was released to the public, and it was a game that a lot of people were checking out because it had Square Enix involved and seemed to be following the recent 3D platformer revival. So something bright and colourful from Square that you could easily fall in love with, as it takes the platforming genre in a bold new direction. Just not a good direction. It blows my mind how many seasoned professionals were involved in the creation of this game, and how none of them were able to course correct at any point during Balan Wonderworld's development. It works around unlocking costumes for your character, which helps to give them abilities beyond having half a dozen buttons for jumping, but the main source of creativity is botched, since none of these costumes do anything interesting, and one of them turns you into a box at random intervals, and I just don't know how this game was made. It's such a joyless, soul-crushing experience that fluctuates from being boring to bafflingly surreal. Like, there's these weird quick-time event sequences that all feel the same, dotted throughout every level where I can feel myself aging every second, but then there's the dance number at the end of every world that I have no idea how to process. What possessed anyone to create a game like this, let alone a studio with a proven track record with talented minds involved from the start? How did they ever, in good conscience, charge full price for this? That's a creative way of ruining Christmas for someone.
By far the worst thing about Balan Wonderworld is the fact that it's not called Balan Wonderland, which is a nice little bit of rhyming and sounds a bit more elegant, and honestly, I can forgive all the boring stuff and the really crazy stuff that doesn't make sense if they just named their fucking game correctly. This is RabbidLuigi, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe for more in the future, and if you want one right now, there's one here about out-of-bounds secrets in video games. It's quite good. I also want to thank my top supporters on Patreon, including the Green Scorpion, Sarah Malion, and Scott Riker. Thank you for watching, and for Christmas I want games developers who know what they're doing.